Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Jennifer Mondino with the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund team. On behalf of the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund and the Legal Network for Gender Equity, I'm so excited to welcome you all to today's presentation on restorative justice for workplace sex harassment and sexual violence. To give you an overview, what we're going to cover today is going to include an introduction to the principles and underlying concepts of restorative justice, a discussion of some examples, some real life examples of the use of restorative justice in situations involving interpersonal violence. And then we're going to have an exploration of the ways in which restorative justice might be used in situations in the workplace, including workplace sex harassment. I want to start by saying thank you to the many attorneys who have volunteered with our legal network for gender equity. We're so grateful for everything that you all do to combat sex discrimination. And thank you also to everyone who has tuned in today and set aside some time to think expansively about what it might mean to bring justice to people experiencing this kind of discrimination. I also want to thank our fantastic presenters for all the work and time that they've put into preparing for this presentation today and in advance for their presentations today. And last but not least, I want to thank my colleague on the Time's Up Legal Defense Fund, Anna Black, for all the behind the scenes work that she has done to get the word out about the presentation and make things run smoothly today. So I am not going to take much time telling you all about the presenters that we have today, although I could take a lot of time because they are an incredibly interesting and accomplished group. You have, with the invitation email, a document that has their brief bio, so I encourage you all to take a look at that document when you have some time. It will also be posted on the National Women's Law Center website together with a recording of this presentation in the coming weeks. But just so that you all know who will be speaking to you all today, we're going to be hearing from Ana Avendaño, who these days is an adjunct professor of law at the University of Texas at Austin and CUNY Schools of Law, Julie Goldscheid, who is a professor of law at CUNY School of Law, Nouri Nusrat, who is a facilitator with the Ahimsa Collective, and Jasmine Story, who is an international restorative justice facilitator and the founder of the People's Coalition. I have found it to be so informative and exciting getting to know them just in preparing for this presentation today. And I know you all are going to learn a lot and be energized by their presentations. So I'm thrilled to bring you this fantastic panel. I'm going to go through some quick housekeeping matters before we get started. First of all, we are going to leave the last 15 minutes of the webinar for Q&A. So know that you'll have some time to raise the questions. During the presentation, though, I'm going to ask folks to stay on mute. And if you have questions or comments, go ahead and drop them in the chat function. Anna Black and I will be monitoring the chat, and I will do my best to have your questions addressed when we get to the Q&A portion of the presentation. Also, if folks want to see a live written transcript of what is being said in the presentation, you can just click on the CC or the closed caption icon at the bottom of the screen, and you should be able to see that while we go along. All right, I think those are all of the housekeeping measures that I wanted to make sure to tell you all about. So without further ado, I am going to turn the microphone over to Nouri and Jasmine to get us started introducing restorative justice.
So right before, I just asked Jasmine if she was okay with me doing a little bit of movement, optional movement. So I'm just going to offer that. What's really important for everyone on the panel and everyone who's participating is this is optional. What's most important is that you listen to you. So that might mean not listening to anything I'm saying and tuning me out. And that's your choice. And that's a great choice. Like what's most important is that you make the choice for yourself. And that might mean trying some of the movements I'm offering. That might mean drinking water. It might mean a lot of things. So what's most important is that you listen to you. But if it sounds interesting to you, you might just notice if you're sitting or standing, you might just notice the surface beneath you. So that might mean like perhaps rocking side to side on it. And you're welcome to turn off your camera or close your eyes if that's useful. Or perhaps rocking back and forth. And just notice that there's something supporting you, whether that's the floor or a chair or a couch. And from here, if you'd like, if it sounds interesting, you might roll your shoulders. You might roll them front to back or back to front. And it might be an experiment, like you get to choose the size and the speed of your movement. And sometimes I move too fast and I realize that, oh, actually this movement isn't serving me right now. It's not helping me. And if you've chosen movement or stillness, you might just notice if it's useful to connect to your breath. So perhaps just noticing your breathing, or perhaps connecting your inhale to one part of your movement and your exhale to another. And if you chose a movement that has a direction, you might try switching directions if that feels useful for you. And this other side also is an experiment. So you might change your speed or change your pace or change how you're breathing. You're welcome to continue with this. But if you'd like a change, the last movement I'll offer is you might try rolling your neck. So that could mean just like half of a roll, or it could mean going all the way around. Or it could mean choosing something totally different than what I'm saying. But if you've chosen any movement, you might again notice if it's useful to connect your breath to some part of that movement. Like I'm inhaling to the right and exhaling to the left. You can continue with what you've chosen, or you might try switching directions if you chose the neck roll. And I'll bring us back together in about 3, 2, and 1. And come back to your screen in whatever way feels useful for you. But just know that while we're on Zoom in this virtual world, movement is available to you if that's available for your body, stillness, breath, all of these things. And what I want for you, and I'm sure many other panelists do too, is that you take care of yourself during this time so that whatever you need for your body to make yourself 1 degree more comfortable, that you get to choose that at any moment during our time together. And now I'll hand it over to Jasmine.
Thank you for reminding us what's really, really important for all of us to remember about the work that we do, which is this type of harm lives in the body. This type of harm lives not only in the physical experience, but also in the internal experience of the individuals impacted and the individuals that love them that are then impacted by this type of harm that we are speaking about. So when it comes to making things better, right? And often with restorative justice, people ask restoring to what, but it's about addressing harm. So when it comes to addressing harm, one thing that we want to remember is that we want to create the conditions for people to experience true transformation also in their body. And so with that, we can move to the next slide. Figure out what this thing is. So I really wanted to start off with an unlearning for those who may have a learning around restorative justice and restorative practices in the continental United States, and really try to expand this story to not be the single story of, quote, this was an indigenous practice, but really to understand the many influences and threads that contribute to the practices that are utilized and the hybrid, almost creolization of practices that you may see in the context of workplace restorative justice, workplace harassment. So we have, starting in the 70s, we have Howard Zehr, who is deeply in relation to not only a Mennonite cultural tradition, but also the impact of an HBC, a historically Black college and university education, serves as the architect of the Victim Offender Reconciliation Program in Indiana. this is really, really important when we think about the way restorative justice interfaces often with systems. I'm going to skip through this timeline just to get us focused on what practices Nuri and I might be speaking on later on in our presentation. So I'm going to jump down to 1989, where we have the Maori people of New Zealand looking at the justice system within New Zealand and seeing something very similar to what we see in the United States, which is a disproportionate impact of a harmful impact on their young men specifically. And with this inquiry came a call for policy to shift this reality. And so in 89, we had the Children, Young Persons and Families Act passed, which forged a pathway for alternative systems, again, alternative processes to be utilized within systems. So connecting that to 78 with VORP. What we see created and remixed to work within these systems is the Family Group Conference, family group being a translation of Whanau family group, which is a process that looks at putting harm in the storytelling to tell the harm in the center and have the community uplift both those who are impacted and those who are responsible in making it as right as possible. Okay, we can go to the next slide. This work in the United States is also heavily impacted by the justice processes that exist in both transitional justice and large scale, nation building in sub-Saharan and West Africa. You can see the presence of that work across this nation. It's really important to understand and acknowledge that the work within the United States is coming and is influenced by the diverse people bringing indigenous knowledge and indigenous ethos from all over the globe onto this continent, as well as the work that has lived and survived 400 years of colonization on this continental US. In 2006, I'd like to really just point out that we have a moment where our conversation about accountability shifts with the Me Too movement. And so though this is not necessarily a point within the restorative justice specific timeline when we're talking about processes and modalities, it is important when it comes to us questioning the concept of accountability and what that looks like. And that is going to be really important. In 2016, we have, in relation to this work being utilized for cases of gender misconduct in college and university settings under Title IX, we have the Campus PRISM report published. It's funny because I'm sitting here and I'm like, and in our brainstorming session, Nuri and I both were present. That was how we met, was at the Campus PRISM report brainstorm think tank back in 2015. And with this work, not only does the impact of the Dear Colleague letter shifting and our understanding of what can be utilized for Title IX shifting with this report, but just questions about also what does prevention and full culture change look like? Because this report includes community building conversations around prevention, as well as holding people responsible upon reentry. So really expanding this conversation about practice and whole organizational approaches. All right, last one of the history section. I want to give a shout out to the work of transformative justice elders and transformative justice practitioners who have been doing work outside of state systems to support community in addressing harm and addressing domestic violence and addressing sexual violence. And just because their work has not been recorded and lauded and researched does not mean that they have not been impacting their communities and turning over how people are experiencing not only space, but in relationship to their peers, colleagues, family members, and friends. And so just to name a few, but I will just highlight Grace Lee Boggs as an elder of many of the individuals who are recently published. Again, those who are published are not necessarily the sole keepers of that knowledge, and that's important to acknowledge. It's also important to acknowledge when we talk about Gen Z entering the workforce, Gen Z has been absolutely heavily impacted and aligned with the transformative justice movement. It's included in their pop culture, down to the HBO new TV show about Gen Zers. They actually passed the Transformative Justice Bible, as they call it, Beyond Survival, to another young person in the context of the television show. So it's important when we think about Gen Z entering the workforce, what are they expecting out of a justice process, and what are they already experiencing? 2020s, that's us, baby. Like this is the question mark of how are we going to contribute. And I'm going to move forward to talk about what is this thing that we're talking about contributing to. Oh, before we do that, I'm going to invite Nuri to also speak on this. What is it important for us to acknowledge about what we are inheriting from the restorative justice movement when it comes to our First Nations here in the continental US?
The thing that I want to say, please add, Jasmine, anything, but I think like one of the big takeaways that I have had, so restorative justice, there's like Western roots that have borrowed and adapted from Indigenous folks. And then there's like a whole different, there's no monolithic Indigenous culture, as many people on this webinar know, right? But there's a different worldview that a restorative justice, like in the Western context, restorative justice has been a response to harm, right? And particularly has been a response to also the harm of the criminal legal system or the criminal punishment system. And that is part of our ethos. But within different Indigenous communities, and there's a listening project, the Restorative Justice Listening Project report that I can send out. Basically what they interviewed a whole bunch of folks from different First Nations and Indigenous communities. And one of the things that was different for each community, but that they had in common was like this process or any practice emerges from their worldview about relationship to each other and to self and to nature, right? So it's like one person, my favorite quote was like, we don't have a word for offender in our language. The word is unhealed. And so that emerges from a worldview about the way they view each human, right? And if I think about our worldview here, like we view humans as disposable, and then we enact a system that, or a criminal punishment system that then disposes of people, right? Without actually attending to harm. And so the thing that I want to say, Jasmine, please add anything else, is that I've always felt like in restorative justice, I really walk the line of noticing that there's things that I've borrowed from Indigenous communities, but that there's no way that what I'm doing is an Indigenous process because the worldview is completely different and I don't come from these communities, right? And so Jasmine, please add anything.
Yes, yes, right. And that's, I used the term creolization earlier because that really is what how I conceptualize the work that I do, is that I have pulled and been influenced by many of the interactions, both the impact of academia being heavily globalized within the West, all the way to what I've done with elders and practitioners from different cultures as I've lived abroad and lived in the States. And so I absolutely resonate with what Nuri says about what is my practice and how do I tell a full story. So as a steward of this work, that's why I try my best, even in a short period like what we have to get allotted together today, to make sure that I'm telling at least an expanded story, that you will never hear out of my mouth, this is an Indigenous practice, and we leave it at that we are going to talk about all of the ways that these practices within the continental US are living and all of the influences that might inform that. But can we name a specific practice that is part of the romanticizing also, that is a part of the first harm of our First Nations? So the romanticizing of them as magical and mythical, therefore it's okay to have a monolithic response to this storytelling, is a part of the erasure that is included in the first harm. And so something that is important for anyone doing this work to understand is that a part of the harm of that you are inheriting as a practitioner of this work is the fact that this movement did take tools from these spaces, take skill sets, modalities, flows of even conversation without applying them to the first harm of this nation's founding. And so my elder, Edward Valandra, who's the editor of Colorizing Restorative Justice, shares that though the field makes repairing harm from wrongdoing a fundamental tenet, acknowledging RJ's indigenous antecedents is not the same as undoing settler colonialism's first harm. So it's really important that I, at one point while working in government, had to realize, despite what I look like, I'm inheriting the impact of Jim Crow working in a municipal government in Alabama. We are also inheriting this within a movement, and we can move on to that. So what is this thing that we're talking about when we say restorative justice? On the next slide, we will have the definition. Restorative justice is a compass, not a map. It utilizes storytelling to name the impact of the harm, acknowledge needs, and imagine solutions that are tailored to the needs and obligations within the community. Nuri, I want to invite you to share your definition of restorative justice.
Yeah, I feel like it changes all the time. So I'm like, what is it right now? I think this feels right. And I think there's a way when I'll talk about the values that it really is about honoring each person's dignity and humanity and uplifting that as we move through process. So like that there's no disposability. I'll just add that to Jasmine's beautiful definition.
Did you mute on purpose?
Oh, didn't I finish talking? Yes, sorry, I was finished talking.
All right, so yeah, we can move on to the next slide. I wanted to include the definition of transformative justice. I think it is important, again, connecting to where this movement is going and how people are understanding. This is going to be particularly important in a post-George Floyd world. So transformative justice, according to Adrienne Maree Brown, acknowledges the reality of state harm, right? So that's the state has both influence in how we react and respond to processes, as well as how we are experiencing harm. Looks for alternative ways to address and interrupt harm, which does not rely on the state, relies on organic creative strategies that are community created and sustained, transforms the root cause of violence, not only the individual experience. So one thing that you're going to see, why would the generation coming behind us be very attracted to this, is because they have a different understanding in their collective consciousness about the root causes of violence, as well as what is questioning the relationship between the state and healing, right? The state and justice. That is what we're seeing in our mass movements. That's across the board, and not just in justice spaces, but environmental spaces. The questioning of the state is something that is going to resonate with the next generation coming into the workforce. Okay. Nuri.
And you see my slide, this is my slide. It doesn't match the beauty of Jasmine's slide. So I just want to acknowledge this looks really sad compared to the rest of the slides you just saw. I just wanted to take a moment. Many of you, like I also have Googled search. I've practiced restorative justice for like, I don't know, 7-8 years, but I also am like, what is it? It's always a changing definition. And I've Googled it many times. And so I want to say, like, I just decided to come up with my own values based on working with like a whole bunch of people in my world, folks that are committed to like radicalize like racial justice and abolition within restorative justice. So these are some values that I practice. And I want to say that if you look them up on the internet, you might find totally different values when it comes to restorative justice. And I'm also paying attention to the time. I want everyone to know that I know we have 17 minutes left. So the thing to like go back one step, I'll explain these values, is that punishment is not a legitimate goal for restorative justice. It is not. Like vengeance and punishment might be things that, whether it's nature or nurture, I want to say nurture, we have been indoctrinated into. These are not a legitimate goal, right? And so accountability is, and accountability is different than punishment. And that sometimes when I'm with people, even in my own life, there's times where I'm totally like, oh yeah, I want you to pay. And I'm like, wait a minute, that's not accountability, right? Like I have to rewind and be like, let me get that vengeance out of me. So I just want to say, like, we're all human and we've all been raised in this society. So I wasn't raised in a place where like vengeance wasn't a goal. And then the other thing about restorative justice is that when we do harm. So it can be, there's practices that just build community, right? But there's also practices around harm. And when we do harm, rather than that violating the state, who does that, like the state kind of like depersonalizes it. It's deeply personal when we are harmed or when we harm someone. And so who we are harming is a human being. And so when we harm someone, we have an obligation to them. And honestly, we have a relationship to them that was not choiceful for that person oftentimes, right? But that harm creates an obligation. And this is from Howard Zare, but also from people before him. And so when we do harm, we have an obligation to try and repair and try and make things right. And so within that, within the processes that we work, these are the values that I try to come back to. So when I'm thinking of like, when I'm preparing someone, I'm asking them a question, these are kind of my sounding board. Like, I'm like, oh, does this question fit my nosiness? Because I'm a nosy person. Or does it actually, is it in line with the values? Not that they're always mutually exclusive, but sometimes they are. I'm like, do I want to know this? And is it really in line with these values? So I'm going to share these values. So uplifting everyone's humanity. I think you've heard me say it multiple times, but like everyone, no matter where they come into the process, has dignity. It's not something that we give to them. They come in with it, and we are to treat them with compassion and dignity, right? And then non-shaming, non-punitive. So storytelling is like a way in restorative justice. So I want to take a really quick second and tell a story that hopefully won't activate anyone. I have a 4-year-old nephew. I live with him, and me and my sister have terrible digestive issues and just bad digestion. So we don't eat like cane sugar. We eat like maple syrup. It's real Californian, like honey and like, oh, these sugar alternatives. I call it harm reduction sugar. And so I didn't realize that we're like going around the house with this attitude that sugar is bad. So there's this kind of shame that we put into sugar. And I didn't know that because it's just me and her. But then we live with this 4-year-old. And so when he was a little bit younger, he would get like sugar treats from other people and hide under our kitchen table and eat them. And it's like, also he's a child, so he doesn't know that just because he can't see us doesn't mean we can't see him. Like obviously we can see him, but he thought we can see him. But I was like, but the deeper issue is like, he thinks that to eat sugar, he has to hide under the table because he's gotten this vibe that this thing is bad. And so knowing that this thing is bad, did it make him want to stop eating like granola bars? No. Did it make him like want to come talk to us about eating granola bars? No, what it made him do was hide. And so I just say that to say like shaming actually doesn't work. Shaming doesn't make people come out into the open with what they're doing. Shaming makes people hide. And it made my nephew hide under a table, right? Like that's not what I want to do to a child. And so the restorative process is like, we are not shaming and we're not punitive. We are trying to like, when I think about the people I talk to, I am saying that you are human and you are always human. And what I want for you is to feel so safe and comfortable with me that you feel comfortable sharing the things that you might be the most ashamed of and the most embarrassed of. And for me, when I've been ashamed in my life, I'm not able to be accountable because I want to hide, right? It's all about me. So I know I'm taking a long time. I'm going to go quicker through the other ones. So strengthening communities, not systems. This is like taking some stuff from the transformative justice world. Is like, what we want is that when we're done with restorative process, people actually know how to do it themselves. This is not something that we need experts for. We want these tools to be, not even these tools, these ways to be accessible. And so that doesn't mean strengthening a nonprofit. I've always worked in nonprofits. It doesn't mean strengthening the criminal punishment system. It means actually having the people understand what they're doing so that they can practice it on their own. Truth telling and truth listening kind of goes with not shaming, not punitive, which is we create opportunities for people to actually speak their truth and then hear deeply other people's truth. And when people, I was trained as a lawyer, but I don't practice. But in my experience, when people think that punishment is going to happen, they do not tell the truth. When my nephew thought he would get punished for eating granola bar, he didn't tell the truth. He just hid under a table, right? It's just like across the board. Sorry, I'm going really fast. I also realized that we're being captioned, so I should go a little slower. The wisdom of those directly impacted. In restorative justice, there are no experts. I am nobody but a person asking some questions, and the wisdom to resolve the harms happening within any community come from those people, come from the community. And it is them together rather than individuals. Each individual has a piece, and together as a whole, kind of microorganism or macroorganism, they have the wisdom. Participation should be voluntary and not coerced. And I think because you all are lawyers, you can imagine many ways that coercion happens. So I won't go too deep into that. Meaningful accountability. And so I want to take a second, like I am sometimes, and I'm sure Jasmine is sometimes called into processes when people are just like, make it go away. And the person who did some harm isn't actually ready to take accountability or doesn't even know what they did or don't want or isn't being supported, let me say, isn't being supported to get to that place. And so I won't do a process unless the person is actually able to be meaningfully accountable. So that means like taking the appropriate time to get them to a place of understanding the impact on them and on the person they harmed and the way structures have impacted that moment, right? So sometimes people want RJ to be fast and sometimes it can't be. Collaborative decision-making is the same kind of as directly impacted. It's all the people together that decide together. As a facilitator, I decide nothing. I offer some processes and some practices, and then needs. Everybody has needs. Person that did harm, the bystander, facilitator, we are attending to everyone's needs and also being super realistic about what can be met and what can't be. And in the prep, having those conversations with people, because we don't want to make them have some expectations that aren't possible, right? Like I want these 12 things. It's going to harm them if they can't get those 12 things unless we've talked about it before, to be like, okay, well, what of those 12 do you really need? And what do you think is realistic? Like that's part of the prep process. So that is all for this really long slide. Thank you for bearing with me. And then in the 9 minutes that we have left, Jasmine so Jasmine is like, oh, just kidding. Go to the next slides. I was like, wait, maybe we don't have time for our other part. Go to these slides and then we'll see. I was gonna hand it back to Jasmine.
I'm gonna speed through. This is gonna be Sonic level. Okay, I'll stop talking. Whole organizational approach. What is really, really important to remember is that restorative justice it survives in fertile soil. And what does fertile soil mean for me? That means that the whole organization or the community that's trying to have this live is doing intentional work in all three spaces, not just responding to harm where RJ lives, but community building that is intentional and real. I got a peek at Square's like community boards and seeing how they use Slack to deeply build community across affinity spaces. That stuff is invaluable when it comes to creating a feeling of obligation for when someone causes harm, right? You have to feel tethered to your community to feel truly obligated to it. Support circles. What are our mechanisms to return people into space in a way that makes the community both feel safe and feel like there's continued supported accountability from the person returning? That's a different question, but a whole organizational approach is what I think is very, very important. Can we go to the next slide? I'm going to skip this. Community circles, you will see circles as practice. Please look into circle practice as one way that people are engaging. It is a modality that utilizes one voice at a time to tell the story of harm, understand needs, and make smart agreements for solutions moving forward. And we can go to the next slide. So this is really important for me because this is the process that I choose and utilize whenever I'm dealing with any instance of violence, incident that involves any identity-based harm, or involves structures and systems in a way that is blatant. Which ends up being most of my processes, surprise. So conferencing process, I have dropped off family group because I can only speak to what this process is that I utilize, not the process it is a descendant of, which is the family group process of the Maori people of New Zealand. And this is how this process runs. It's a process that utilizes inquiry. A facilitator team meets with each potential participant and utilizes restorative inquiry to gauge accountability, understand interest in process, understand the harms through the storytelling of the participant, understand the needs as the participant is sharing with them. I love what Nuri was saying about the wisdom living with the impacted, and then to also gauge safety concerns. This is where you're also looking for issues of coercion or anything like that. From this space, this is where we're having intentional conversation about what needs to be done to get us ready for a conference. Conferences do not necessarily have to run face-to-face. They are scripted process that walk the participants through through storytelling all the way to making solutions based on the needs identified in the process. Because it is the scripted process, it can happen at a distance through letter writing, through video exchange. I have done with domestic violence cases, letter writing back and forth as the process that we utilize, but still using the scripted conference modality. But what gets us ready for the conference is this magical thing in between that I like to call pre-work. Pre-work is everything any participant needs to get them ready to be in the conference. If you think about inquiry and pre-work, this is your rehearsal. Your conference is the play. By the time you get to the play, everybody knows their lines, right? Of course, there's new birth and transformation that happens in this space, but the pre-work part of the process allows us to get the mental health support we need, to have an experience learning around the harm. I've dealt with more harm parties than not. Responsible parties than not, who really didn't understand, had a deep learning gap when it came to their impact. And so having a place for them to experience learning that does not involve the person who they have harmed being that educator is unbelievably important to me. And so in this inquiry space, that's where I'm listening and I'm asking, would you like support around understanding this part of the process? This part of the harm, this part of the incident, this part of the context that created the conditions for this incident. And then partnering with someone who can and is willing and is paid to do that kind of education. In a higher ed context, when we're building these systems, for me, I would say, please do not lean on Black students to tell the student who brought a Confederate flag to class why that was wrong. Please partner with someone who is paid in the community as an educator, right? Someone who's communicated that is the job they would like to take on how to do this, and partner that person with the student who brought the Confederate flag, right? One, they're protected, they're paid, and they are actively choosing by their job profession to be an educator in this way, right? So there's lots of levels of consent involved there. This also might involve self-reflection, right? Self-reflection can continue to happen as maybe the responsible party who is very ready to do this and the harm party who is working through their own pre-work, maybe around mental health support, maybe around community support, maybe even professional support. We can keep the process running and continue to do work like self-reflection. And then of course there's follow-up. This is very, very important. We do not finish a conference and then leave people to their own devices. We need to make sure that the obligations that were set in that conference are met in the timely manner that they were agreed upon originally. And that is the responsibility of the facilitators to make sure that that is followed through, or the system that is built within a facilitator team to make sure that there is somebody who is intimate with the process that can make sure that that follow-up happens. Time-wise, I just want to show one more slide, and then I think that's it. I think we just don't have our questions, and that'll be okay. Okay, we're gonna skip this one. So the last thing that I want to share is how I listen for harm as a facilitator in this process, because this is my baby. This is what makes me most excited about how I've contributed to this movement. So I listen to harm in the processes in a way that is categorical. This allows me to detether a harmful moment and expand beyond a word like gaslighting and really break down all of the things involved with gaslighting. If I'm working with two colleagues and one is like, they gaslit me over 3 months, I want to understand what is the emotional harm connected to being gaslit. The emotional harm connected to being gaslit might be feeling manipulated, disregarded, dismissed, belittled, right? But what is the material harm of being gaslit? Maybe this had a professional impact on the person who is being harmed and harassed. that is a material loss. Maybe it's also a financial loss. Maybe it's a loss of time as they were trying to figure out and navigate through this maze of lies that this person has put in front of them. What is the communal harm? Well, if they're having their world be crafted by somebody else, you can imagine all of the different relational harms that might be born out of just the quote term, an experience of being gaslit. And then the inflamed structural and the inflamed historical harm. This describes harm that activates, throws fire, throws gasoline on wounds that are old. So in the example of two colleagues dealing with one gaslighting the other, using that term specifically, we might say that this was them inflaming a gender imbalance in the workplace. We might say that this is inflaming power imbalance, historical power imbalance, or maybe it's an actual historical harm like violence in the medical field for women, right? So naming that specifically so that when we're making plans to address the needs born out of these harms, they are tailored directly to this. It's very hard for someone who's been harmed to look and say, I've been gaslit, and figure out what is a solution that's going to meet my needs, right? It's hard to jump from A to B. What I do in my processes is I break and detether that experience so that we can make tangible plans around very specific parts and elements of the harmful experience that they had. And so that is our time. And I thank you for our very quick introduction to all that is restorative justice and restorative justice, specifically for me as a practitioner, this is the conferencing process that I utilize. Thank you, Nuri. Thank you.
Thank you, Nuri and Jasmine. That was fascinating. And I think that we can plan to bring in some of the questions that you all wanted to discuss into the Q&A portion at the end. Now we're going to turn it over to Professor Goldchild and Professor Avendano to talk about applying restorative justice in the context of the workplace. And so I will turn it over to the two of you.
Great. And it's fine to call me Julie. Thank you. So thank you so much for organizing this, and to Nuri and Jasmine for your introduction, which I learned so much and have so many more questions. So I look forward to our conversation. We're going to try to transition from that overview and introduction to making our conversation a little more workplace specific. And we'll structure our part of the presentation by talking a little bit about why consider restorative approaches in workplace sexual harassment specifically. We'll summarize the scholarship and research about gender violence and restorative justice. We'll talk about how the possibility of using restorative justice processes in sexual harassment cases maps against our main legal frameworks for addressing sexual harassment on the job. And then we'll talk about some practical examples and issues. So next slide, please. Okay, so why think about restorative approaches when we're thinking about problems of sexual harassment and other forms of discrimination in the workplace? When we think about the persistence of sexual harassment and other types of discrimination, notwithstanding decades of law reform, we should step back and think about what other forms of approaches, strategies, techniques might do a better job of advancing prevention and spurring meaningful accountability. We've had a lot of progress in terms of law reform, but we still have a lot of sexual harassment and discrimination. So that should prod us to think about alternative additional approaches that might do a better job of meeting the goals of preventing harassment and providing redress for the people who are harmed. It's also a way of addressing the parallel critiques of carceral responses to gender violence outside of the workplace and the limits of anti-discrimination law. So I'll just say a little bit about both of those. Within the movement to end gender violence, there's an increasing recognition, as many of you may know, that hyper-punitive responses and focus on incarceration, which have been the dominant policy and legal approaches of the last several decades, really haven't been effective in ending violence. There's a parallel critique of workplace discrimination laws, not the same, but parallel in some ways, and I'll just highlight some of the concerns that people have raised. Many have argued that the current legal anti-discrimination framework, in some ways like the criminal legal system that's been used to address intimate partner violence outside of the workplace, also fails to advance meaningful accountability. People like Professor Joanna Grossman have argued that our employment discrimination frameworks promote compliance cultures rather than cultures that are committed to ending discrimination. Other studies show that current practices and current employer responses to our anti-discrimination legal frameworks may lead to polarization and resentment in the workplace rather than to reducing discriminatory conduct and promoting true equality. There's data that shows that the adversarial nature of anti-discrimination law imposes particularly high costs on plaintiffs, especially African Americans and other people of color, and that our legal responses reinscribe rather than interrupt stereotypes about those in marginalized groups. So really contrary to what the goals that you would hope our anti-discrimination laws advance. Similarly, many have shown that employer concerns with avoiding liability disincentivizes reflection, apology, responsibility, and growth, which are the kinds of things you would think employers and employees alike would want to cultivate in the workplace. And finally, in contrast to recommendations that our policies, specifically addressing gender violence, focus on survivors, there's a real dearth of data on what survivors actually want. The assumption behind many of our policies and our laws is that survivors want punishment, they want discipline, they want termination. And that may in fact be the case in some instances, but it also may not be the case in many instances. There are some studies that show that survivors want safe and harassment-free workplaces, but they don't necessarily want punishment. They may want things like warning letters and education and other kinds of responses, but not necessarily the kind of investigative and punitive responses that dominate our approaches. So this all leads to thinking about what are the best mechanisms for changing workplace cultures and how could restorative processes advance that? And I'll turn to Anna.
Thanks, Julie. It's really nice to be here with you, and thank you so much for the really excellent overview of restorative and transformational practices. I'm going to talk a little bit about this issue of workplace culture, whereas my work and my research are focused on right now. And it's been really interesting to sort of watch the post-Weinstein et al. Moment develop and hold. We've seen a lot of powerful men fired, lose their jobs, even in some instances be canceled, at least temporarily. But at the end of the day, what we know is that sexual harassment is not simply a problem of individual behavior. That in order to eradicate harassment from the workplace, sexual harassment, racial harassment, disability harassment, the social science shows that organizational climate is the single most important factor in determining whether sexual harassment is likely to occur in a work setting. And I'm quoting the conclusions of this excellent study conducted by the National Academies of Science, Medicine, Engineering. And I think that it's also really important to think about the workplace culture through the frame of prevention. Let's not forget that, as the Supreme Court reminded us in Farragher, the primary objective of Title VII is not to provide redress, but to avoid harm in the first place. And I think focusing on workplace culture or climate is a really accessible way of keeping the workforce, as Julie put here, in a way where people can focus on their jobs, the careers thrive, and bullies don't. So what is organizational climate? Technically, it's defined as the shared perceptions within an organization of the policies, practices, and procedures in place. In other words, why are the policies and procedures in place? How do people experience them? How are they implemented? What behaviors are rewarded, supported, and expected? who is valued and who is not, what kind of behavior is valued, who gets to speak at meetings. There are really brilliant folks. My friend Casey Wagner from Cornell is on this call, who do climate assessments for organizations that help organizations understand what their climate and their culture is. The more the climate is seen as permissive of sexual harassment, the greater the likelihood that harassment is likely to occur. That permissive environment actually emboldens perpetrators, because they get the signal that the climate, the culture is not dissuading that behavior. And at the same time, it has the really harmful impact that it can send the message to survivors that it is not okay to report, that the reports are not going to be welcome. They're not going to be seen as part of the team. I worked with one woman who told me that within a social justice organization, when she reported her harassment, she was told to put her big girl panties on. So these are signs that the climate, the culture is not actually conscious of eradicating sexual harassment. And the value that I see, and I've been working with organizations on implementing restorative practices in the workplace, is that they are a mechanism that employers have to begin to provide safe and healthy and productive workspaces. They are a way to intervene, to interrupt before harm occurs, before harm rises to a level that it's legally actionable. It's a way for survivors to have a voice and agency instead of being bystanders or witnesses to their harm. And it is also a mechanism for those who cause the harm to have a moment of self-reflection and an opportunity to learn and show up better. Accountability is key, and we're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but when implemented in a way that makes sense for the particular organization, these practices are actually very helpful. They're not an alternative to whatever compliance practices employers might be told that they need to keep in place, but they certainly are a mechanism to strengthen the workplace. So Julie, back to you.
I think next slide. Unless Anna, did you something else you wanted to say about?
No.
Okay, great, good. Okay, so so we're talking about. So what I'm going to summarize here, and I'm hesitating only because there's a big body of scholarship and research on restorative justice and gender violence that I'm going to try to summarize very quickly, because I want to make sure that we have time to talk about examples and issues and questions. But just to really connect the thread, when we're talking about restorative justice and sexual harassment on the job, I'm thinking about sexual harassment as a form of gender violence, right? Gender violence exists on a continuum. Much of the scholarship and research on restorative justice and gender violence has focused on gender violence outside of the workplace: sexual assault, intimate partner violence, stalking, other forms of gender violence. But of course, sexual harassment on the job includes all of those things. So when we think about what would it mean to incorporate restorative justice into the workplace, looking to examples, research, conversation, dialogue about restorative justice and gender violence is a place to start. And that's part of where I started when I started thinking about how restorative justice might be used to address gender violence, sexual harassment in the workplace. So restorative justice has been the subject of feminist debates, particularly with respect to gender violence within feminist communities. And I'll highlight just a few of the concerns and some of the reasons that I think it's nevertheless really important to consider restorative justice, and the reasons that many people have begun pilot programs and begun working on using restorative justice in instances of sexual harassment and gender violence. So some of the concerns center around concerns about the dynamics of abuse and harassment, and concerns that restorative processes won't adequately take into account the dynamics of abuse, that restorative processes could perpetuate dynamics of abuse and cycles of abuse and violence, that a lack of understanding of the particular dynamics, particularly of intimate partner violence, will operate so that offenders won't be held truly accountable. And those of you who are familiar with some of the debates about the use of mediation for intimate partner violence and sexual assault cases are familiar with some of these debates. Some have raised concerns that gender violence isn't suited for restorative justice because survivors may respond under conditions of restraint, and that practitioners won't take meaningful steps to support survivor safety. Others have raised concerns that there's a risk of reprivatizing gender violence. You know, the thrust of so much advocacy for decades, advocacy that, you know, many of us have been a part of, has been to bring sexual violence, gender violence out of the nature of the private and to make it public, to have it recognized as a public concern. And some have raised concerns that using restorative justice would reprivatize gender violence. Nevertheless, there are many reasons to consider and to explore using restorative justice in gender violence cases, many of which we've begun to talk about already. Survivors want to be heard, and their experience is that civil and criminal legal systems don't afford that opportunity and instead often are re-traumatizing. Survivors want the violence to stop. They want the opportunity to reinforce community norms against violence and gender bias, and that our current systems don't stop violence and don't keep survivors safe. When we think about the workplace, there are parallel critiques. Think about the limitations of the litigation system. Many people, as we all know, don't make formal complaints. Many people don't have access to litigation. There are a whole host of reasons: lack of access to counsel, dim prospects for prevailing, the fear of retaliation, just to name a few. So there are so many reasons to focus, as Anna was saying, on prevention, on culture change, on meaningful accountability, and restorative justice is one way to do that. And I just highlight a few other scholars who have begun to look at this issue. Next slide, please. So when I started looking at this, I thought, well, and many people said to me, oh, there isn't a lot that's been written about gender violence and restorative justice. And I learned that actually there was a fair amount, both in terms of some of the scholarship that I drew from and the referencing in the previous slides, and also in terms of empirical research. And I'll just highlight some of the responses. So much of the research on restorative justice has focused on youth crime, where many more restorative justice programs have started, but there's a growing body of research on restorative justice and gender violence. They may be small studies, maybe small sample sizes, may have some methodological issues, but overwhelmingly, the responses suggest favorable results. And you'll see the bullet points I have listed there in terms of victim satisfaction, victim participation, victim voice, they're feeling that they're heard, and even a decrease in violence. So I could say more about some of the studies, but I think what's important for us at this point is the takeaway that they suggest that restorative processes, which, as you can see, there's a broad umbrella, means many different things, but hold promise for meeting some of the goals that we would hope that any kind of system responding to problems such as sexual harassment and other forms of inequality and discrimination in the workplace would hope to address. Next slide, please. Okay, so I know that the lawyers in the audience are thinking, okay, this all sounds really good, but what does it mean in terms of liability and counseling clients and you know, what happens when it fails? So I'll highlight some of the big picture issues, and we'll flag some issues and challenges, because I think this is an evolving area where we will be learning more as time goes on, and where there's an opportunity for advocacy to help create processes that do the best job of advancing prevention and reducing violence and creating better systems in the workplace. Okay, so what I put on this slide here are some of the important takeaways from the legal framework articulated by the Supreme Court for employer liability for sexual harassment. So those of you who are lawyers will know that the Supreme Court has articulated a framework under which employers will be liable for sexual harassment by supervisors, where the harassment culminates in a tangible employment action. Where there's no tangible employment action, an employer will be liable if it fails to satisfy what many of you will know as the affirmative defense, that the employer exercised reasonable care to prevent and correct harassing behavior, and that the plaintiff unreasonably failed to take advantage of the preventive or corrective opportunities the employer provided. In addition, employers also may be liable for sexual harassment by someone other than a supervisor, such as a coworker or a customer, if the employer knew or should have known of the harassment and failed to take prompt and effective legal action. So imagine if an employer adopts a restorative process in response to an employee's complaint of sexual harassment, and the employee wants to engage in the restorative process. How will this map onto potential liability down the road? So whether the restorative process resolved the problem could be relevant to whether the employer exercised reasonable care to prevent and correct harassing behavior, or whether it failed to take prompt and effective remedial action. So we can see why this is a question it's really important to tend to and to think through if anyone is considering adopting restorative processes in the workplace. There's a cautionary tale here. You know, the EEOC has said that an employer response to sexual harassment or other forms of discrimination should be designed to stop the harassment, to correct its effects on the employee, and to ensure that the harassment does not recur. But in fact, courts have held that employers have met their legal obligations simply by enacting policies. So not taking the kind of searching inquiry into whether or not what the employer did actually ended the harassment. So this all highlights, and this is, you know, kind of big picture way for us to start having the conversation, highlights the importance of being very intentional in adopting restorative practices, to be very clear about parameters and expectations, about employer liability, about goals of a restorative process before engaging in them. And I'll just leave this part there as a jump off point for more discussion. We've bulleted a number of issues and challenges here. I'll mention two, and then I'll turn to Anna. So one is confidentiality. You know, we have models from things like mediation, settlement agreements, and so forth that would need to be taken into account. Again, thinking that someone who raises a sexual harassment complaint, for example, may ultimately want to bring a formal complaint if a restorative process isn't successful. So confidentiality is an issue to consider, as well as preserving the right to sue. So just flagging those issues in the interest of time, and I'll turn to Anna to name a few others.
Thank you, Julie. And I think also it would be great if you shared with the group your excellent law review article, because I see that some folks already are asking for citations. I'm just going to touch on a couple of these. There are so many issues to discuss here, and this is really an emerging area where there's so much possibility and so much room for input from all of you out there in the field, who I can't see right now, but I'm sure you're there, to bring your experiences to really create, and this is not just an alternative dispute resolution mechanism. It really is a way to interrupt toxic behavior early to create safer and, you know, better workplaces. The one piece I want to focus on right now, conscious of time, is the bullet point on how to make it more acceptable to truly accept responsibility. And this is something that we come across a lot, because these processes, as we heard from Jasmine and Nuri, have to be voluntary. And the person who caused harm has to be ready to accept responsibility. we live in a society where responsibility is equated with punishment. And so in some ways we have to unlearn all of these, gut reactions that we have to taking responsibility, that just as people assume that something's going to come from that. I'll get suspended, I'll get demoted, I'll get fired. And create space for accountability to be a change in behavior, but it has to proceed with a recognition of the harm that the harm doer caused. And that is not an easy thing for people to do. And so I'll just give you 4 factors. Again, this is very superficial, and this is the work that happens in what Jasmine described as her pre-work when you're working with the harm doer, is to try to get a feel, is this person ready to take responsibility, to take accountability? Is the person ready to name the wrongdoing? In other words, I did so-and-so. Acknowledge the harm done. As a result of what I did, here's how people were hurt. Is the person ready to seek to make reparations of some kind? I will make sure this never happens again by doing so-and-so, and that the person is ready to try to make things as right as possible. In other words, I will show up differently by so-and-so, so that you have a real sense that the harm doer has accepted responsibility for that harm. Again, outside of the punitive context. And that's not easy to do. Sometimes educational coaching may help you. That is an acceptable step to take under Title VII for employers. So there are ways of working with people, as Jasmine described, educational coaching, etc., to make sure that they are ready to take that responsibility. Also, remember that to center those who have been harmed. And we assume that because sexual harassment is seen as an individual injury to be remedied under Title VII, which is an individual rights statute, that it is only the survivor who has been harmed, when in fact, the science, the research shows that sexual harassment is a collective injury, that coworkers who witness the harassment are also harmed. The family of the survivor is also harmed, and often the community. So remembering to center the survivor, but also the others who have been harmed by the perpetrator's behavior. I think those are the sort of the steps that take a lot of intention and work. And then there's questions like who's going to pay, but things that are more, we deal with this in all kinds of other contexts. I just also want to underscore the importance of having practitioners who are trained or have some experience in the field. I have seen folks say, oh, I'm ready to do a restorative justice process because they see it as an alternative to something else. And so they just jump in and doing it. And that can cause a lot of harm because, as you've heard from the practitioners, it is an intentional process that requires care and thought. So I'll stop there. I know we only have 3 minutes. Pass it back to you, Julie.
I think we're ready for the next slide and some examples. So Anna, do you want to?
Yes.
Yeah.
So I'm going to just share one example that I'm working on right now, which I think it captures a lot of what we've been talking about, where is a nonprofit that at the board of directors, who has substantial control over the operation of the organization, although not deeply embedded in the work of the organization. There was an instance of several instances actually of sexual harassment by a person who was very powerful within the organization, both in terms of actual supervisory power, but also normative power. And the one of the survivors reported it, and there was a union actually in the shop, and the union, and she was told to go to HR. And she filed her complaint with HR, and that's the last she ever heard of the complaint. The board hired a white shoe law firm to conduct an investigation, which is, nothing wrong with that. I mean, well, the standard practice. The investigation revealed that the harassment occurred, and the harasser was immediately filed. But the harm that this incident and the response caused to the relationships on the ground in the workplace, how the survivor herself felt that she didn't feel supported, the rumors and gossip that started among the workers themselves. And so much of this was because this black hole that is often HR is not responsive, does not center the survivor, and doesn't look at situations like this in terms of the harms that they cause beyond the actual legal violation. And so the beauty of restorative process is that they're not driven by breaking rules, but by recognizing that in these kinds of situations, it's the relationships that are broken that have to be healed. So we're developing and going through right now a restorative process with the support of the board and management to bring people back together to where they trust each other, they trust their supervisors, and they can focus on doing their work. It's not a short process. It's going to take months, but the intention is there. And to be honest, in this kind of a situation where the traditional legal process was put into place and caused the dynamics that were pretty predictable, were extremely harmful. Often we just overlook those and the world keeps going. I think the pandemic has had an impact on that, but that's something for another day. So it just cases like this give me hope that we're coming to a recognition that we have to try something new, because if we're actually valuing the safety, the health of workers, then we have to stop thinking just beyond the rigid legal structures and legal guidelines. Thank you.
Great. I want to make sure before we move to Q&A, Julie and Anna, did you feel like you said the pieces that you wanted to say? I know we didn't give you a lot of time, but are we okay moving to Q&A?
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. I'm seeing you all nod. Okay. So we've gotten a few questions in the chat. People who are listening in, if you have questions, this is the time to drop those in the chat and we will try to bring them up. I have some questions too that I was thinking about asking you all, but before I do, Nuri and Jasmine, I know you all thought about having a presentation where you two got to ask questions one another, and especially after hearing Julie and I pose a question
Jennifer, you broke up a
to each
little.
other, or
You broke up, Jennifer.
I broke up a little. Uh-oh. Okay, I'm going to try it again. Is this any better?
Yes.
Yes. Okay. I was saying that I'd love to start by giving Nuri and Jasmine a chance to pose questions to one another or maybe to the whole group, because I know they had planned originally as part of their presentation to be able to ask some questions in response to what they had heard from each other. So Nuri and Jasmine, do you have any questions that you'd like to raise to get us started?
I have one that can be, now that I've listened to you, I took so many notes on what everyone said. So I think this goes to maybe everybody, which is within an individual harm situation, like the structure is what creates the conditions that allow that harm to happen. And so within, and I know Jasmine does this in her processes, so you and everybody, when you're addressing like a harm that happened, people are calling you in for one harm, right, between individuals. How do you actually help them transform the structures so that these harms, which means culture change really, right? Like, so that they stop creating the container for harm to continue. And Anna, it sounds like in the process that you're doing too, that's relevant. So I'm sure other people have that same question, so I can just throw it out there.
Jasmine?
I'm sorry you went out a little bit, so I didn't capture your whole question, but I think it was my internet. So I will pass it. If anybody else has an answer, I will follow.
Okay. Let me just start. I think this is a great question, and especially in the workplace, because for restorative practices to work in the workplace, the employer is the entity that is often the harm doer. I mean, even if the coworker is the actual harm doer, which is the large majority of situations, is coworker on coworker harassment. The employer has a role to play in this. So we have to make sure that the employer shows up in some way that is genuine and willing to adjust practices. And we have to, as in the pre-work that Jasmine described, which I also do, it's really working with the employer so that they understand that they do not need to replace their entire toolbox of policies that they've developed over the years to comply with legal precedent that is going to give them safe harbor defenses, that they can preserve those, and with those add on some practices that are going to be helpful. Sometimes it may require in a nonprofit situation, for the board to be part of that discussion, because it is the board that is the governing entity, and that they have to change their own practices and even a structure. In some cases, maybe the makeup of the board is so disconnected from the work of the organization that is creating the culture that is causing the harm. There has to be an openness to real change. And to do that, you have to build the trust in the process and in those that are guiding the process, because fear is often fear of the unknown, especially in this work that's relatively new. So we are in many ways co-creating these systems right now. Jasmine?
Thank you so much. I absolutely agree. Like, yes, ditto, 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 affirmation to that. I want to say that you can, in the formal process, which you might be utilizing in your inquiry as well, how you talk about harm can also empower those who have caused harm in the process of making it right to really reflect and utilize their power position within an organization and activate their social capital to make the changes that they have identified in their pre-work, created the conditions that allowed this harm to happen over a period of time or happen in that instance. And so just a quick example, I had a case that dealt with a resident assistant and a resident that involved a homophobic conversation, a transphobic conversation, a conversation that absolutely fell under a sexual harassment because of the conversation around people's body parts, unbelievably invasive. And after doing all of the work, the resident assistant at the end of the process was able to look up at the list of needs and see their position within the organization to make changes for one of the structural harms that was identified was the fact that the safe zone trainings happened at the end of the day, at the end of the week, at the end of the hour of their week-long training. So when it comes to the structure, as Julie and Anna both brilliantly showed how policy creates and communicates who is important at this organization by putting that training at the very end of the very last moment of their initial employee training. They were communicating who was important, right? And it wasn't the LGBTQ plus community. And so if you build it into your process, if you allow your participants to engage with that as a harm that needs to be addressed, then it allows them to strengthen their own response and allows them to be a part of the solution, which will help the harmed party feel like something good came out of that. And you'll see that in the scholarship about what victims want. They want to know something better in the world came out of me moving forward with an accountability process. And so actually seeing the person who caused them harm use their power that they abused in the instance they caused harm to actually make structural changes that will impact people in the future in the workplace is one way that you can support making those structural changes within an interpersonal process.
Great. I'm going to read out a really interesting question that has just come up in the chat, which is this one: what and how to address when the harmed party feels that the acknowledgement or apology is not authentic? What do you folks think about that one?
Please, anyone jump in. I'm going to say like two things, which is one is this is where like, let's be really transparent that in a restorative process, there is an element of power. So I, as a facilitator, when I am preparing someone, that is my job, is to see if it feels authentic. And I'm not just going to ask if it's authentic. I'm going to ask 10 million different things in different ways. But also, I think this also, I'm adding a question to my answer, which is like the amount of education you do with folks, particularly like, yeah, all of you. And if any of that is like tangible documents and videos and stuff, or is it just conversation? So I'll say like a small story, which is when I was preparing someone for a sexual harm process, like at first they were like, well, I don't really remember doing it. Or like, then I was like, I was on drugs and I was like, okay, well, I've done those drugs before. And I like, remember if I would have touched someone. So it's like very conversational and very loving. Like, so that wouldn't fly with me if I was the survivor, because I'd be like, well, I do those drugs too. And like, and I remember touching people. So why don't you remember? And then he couldn't remember why he picked her. And I was like, okay, well, that also wouldn't fly with me. So like, we just keep digging and digging. And I think this like maybe is illuminating another point that I'd like to say, which is the person then eventually said like, oh, I liked her. And I was like, so then my brilliant co-facilitator was like, well, could you go tell your friends, this is a boy that touched a girl. She was like, could you go tell your guy friends that you like a girl? And he just started laughing like it was so laughable. No, obviously the answer is no. She was like, well, could you go tell them that you touched a girl on her body? He was like, yeah, totally. We could say like we motorboat, we do this. So like one to the question is like, I'm trying to get to that authentic accountability. And if I don't hear that it's there, then I'm not going to move forward with the process. And that and I'll offer the survivor something different. Like, do you want to circle with your people? Do you want to circle? Like healing cannot be dependent on the person taking accountability, because that also centers again the person that did the harm. So we have to think of other ways. And then there is power in my role as a facilitator to see like, does this feel authentic? And I want to say like, that is power. I have power and like that. And then to like the other point I'm making is like, in this situation, which is the entire culture we live in, this boy found it easier to tell his friends, his guy friends, that he could touch someone's body than that he actually had authentic, deep feelings for her. So he didn't create that. He didn't create that. He was a young person. The world, the place, the ocean we're swimming in, which is this culture, created that. And that's why I think I was asking both Anna and Jasmine and Julie about structural change. It's like, this is not just the workplace. This is the culture that actually like people's bodies, consent is not something we value, right? We aren't allowed to actually be authentic and have real conversations about feelings, but we can talk about like gross, like conquest, right? And so like, that is also part of the conversations I'm having with people to get to that accountability, but I don't do it through, and I think this might be a failing of mine. I don't do it through like actual political education. I do it through conversation, but I think that I should grow in that area. So that was like a very long-winded, windy answer.
No, that was great, Nori. If I can just add a little bit to that, I'm so glad you raised the issue of both the issue of what real accountability looks like and the necessity for working with folks who are and not centering the process on the person who is accepting accountability. Because something that it's a phenomenon that I have seen that at first I was confused, but now I've seen it happening more time. I recently had someone come to me. I do conflict resolution with an organization, and a friend asked me to talk to someone who had been accused, and he came to me and called me and told me that he had his RJ team assembled and he was ready to go into the process. And so I asked him, well, who did you harm? And he wasn't able to articulate the harm that he had caused. He was able to articulate what he had been accused of. He was able to explain to me the becauses, they probably heard this. So I did not work with that person because, I did not believe that a restorative process in that particular situation was ripe yet. It doesn't mean never, but this person had to do a lot more work to get to the point where he, in this case, it was a he, was going to be able to participate in the process that centered the person he had harmed, not himself. And he clearly wasn't there. And without the centering the survivor or the community harmed, and arriving at a method of accountability that makes sense to them, you don't have justice. So I just want to, if I can jump ahead, Jennifer, really quickly to a question here about the who pays, and then I'll hand it back to the wonderful folks from the collaborative from Honeycomb, because the question of who pays, I hear this question a lot. And if the employer pays, does that mean that the facilitator is somehow beholden to the employer? The answer is no. And I feel strongly that the employer should pay. Facilitators should be compensated. This is hard work. It's very intentional work. We do this work out of love and also as a profession. The workers shouldn't have to pay for this process. We live in a capitalist society. The employer is the holder of the wealth. So the employer absolutely should pay for this process. That does not mean that the employer should retain control over the process. It is the facilitator's job to work with the employer to develop guidelines, a contract that gives the facilitator the freedom to consult with certain people in the organization, including those harmed, to have consensus about moving forward, or some process that builds the trust among those involved, that it isn't just one entity, this sort of employer sitting on the side that's controlling the process. So I'll hand it back to you.
Great. I'm going to jump in for one moment. Thank you for those great answers, and Anna for jumping ahead. There are a bunch of questions in the chat that I will sort of group together as, how does this all work anyway? And I see that we don't have so much time. So I wonder, and I think I'm going to put this to Julie and Jasmine, if you all can tell people where they can go to learn more about what this would look like. And maybe you can throw into your answers where they would learn more about, Julie, your article that is forthcoming, and Jasmine, your organization.
Sure, I can start and say quickly, I put a link in the chat to where the article that contains the research and the studies that I referenced, and also some examples of where restorative justice is being used in employment contexts, and also in schools. I know some of the examples that Nuri and Jasmine referenced seem to reference schools, whether elementary school or maybe higher ed. And, you know, there's been some really important work that's been done in education. Some of you may know about the Dalhousie example from Canada, right? I see familiarity. And so, you know, since I wrote a law review article, it has citations to things that I knew about. There are no doubt things that should be in there that I still do have an opportunity to add since it's not finalized yet. So I welcome suggestions from other panelists and also from folks who may be viewing. But I put a link there, and if you didn't catch the link, I can send it again, or you can just email me. And if you catch my last name and Google that and CUNY Law School, you should find my email address really easily. So I'll say that to be short. Jasmine?
So to answer the question about like, where do you find this work? Where do you get this work? There are individual practitioners working all over the place. It's really important, if you are looking to work with an individual practitioner, that you ask, as I like to say, what is their origin story around this work? Please ask all of the questions. Please know that this work is not something that is controlled by a certifying body. I hope that it never is. But with that means it's really important that practitioners are transparent about what they can do, what they have done, and what they are willing to do. So please make sure that you ask all of those questions. Honeycomb Justice Consulting is a group of DI, Transformative Justice, and Restorative Justice practitioners that work to support communities in implementing restorative justice into their systems, as well as handling and supporting individuals through their own processes and their own healing justice processes. So if you are interested in that, that is who we are. And as you can tell by our name, a lot of our work has been very much influenced by the transformative justice movement and my personal farming and doula work. So just really nature focused. I also wanted to touch on last question, management of client expectations. That's really, really important. In my practice, I don't promise anything. I do illuminate and expose my whole process though. So to create an understanding of the expectation, I want to show what they can expect. You don't get that through a traditional punitive process. There's no guarantee what questions might come across to you, for you, what lines of inquiry might be explored. But with the restorative process, if you're using a conferencing model like I utilize, it's scripted and I do not deviate from that model. And so showing that and being very transparent about that is one way that I manage client expectations, because what they can see is that this is the container and this container can only hold so much. And then what we can speak about is that we will always celebrate consent throughout our process, which means it doesn't mean we have to get off the highway, but it does mean we can pull over to a rest stop, right? So how do I show that consent is not only a part of why we were here in the first place, but it's something we're going to celebrate in our process, which means if expectations, you don't feel like they're being met, if you are running up against something that feels challenging or hard or feels like something worth derailing, we can shift.
Great. Well, I am seeing that we are just at the end of time. We are getting all of these really interesting questions. If folks have lingering questions, I will offer up that you can reach out to me or reach out to Legal Network at nwlc.org. That's the address for the Legal Network for Gender Equity. And I will try to reach out to our fabulous presenters and get some input from them. Thank you all for these amazing presentations. I found this to be really informative and illuminating, even after the prep work with all of you and reading the articles and things. So I really appreciate all of your presentations and everyone for tuning in, and have a good rest of the day, everyone.